Hey there, Peter Olsen. I'm back. Welcome to Lesson 4. Force change, create a crisis. Um, this is a real important lesson regarding how to basically bring about change in your marriage. But before we move on to Lesson 4, want to make sure you're not just kind of going through these lessons, but actually you're taking that one or two point or points and applying them to your life. Because you know, my goal, and I hope that your goal, is to actually achieve a magnificent marriage that doesn't happen with just watching a course for a little while, but rather, like much of life, you need to take action. So, what are you going to do with lesson 3? What's the matter with kids? Um, how about creating and being really intentional about creating some fun for your wife and mother of your child or children post birth? Because that's a tough time. That's a tough time at a physical, psychological, and social level for a woman after she's given birth. What are you going to do to really create some fun within the context of your family and marriage, but even outside of that, in terms of just finding some independent activities, friends, groups? Why don't you do that right now? Create some fun for your wife in that post-birth time. Secondly, just a few points to highlight. Why don't you spend a meal or a few hours and simply start dreaming and planning specifically for some of your future milestone anniversaries, and particularly some of those early empty nest years. What are you going to do? What's something big, exciting that you're going to do 6 months after your child or your last youngest child is graduated from high school or college? I don't think pick one. But, right, you can probably make that date pretty clearly. High school, I would guess you could make it exact. College, it seems like you get pretty 50-50 in terms of children maybe getting through college these days in 4, sometimes 5 years. But you can probably get that down to, a ballpark of a year. What's something you want to do 6 months after your kid graduates college? Maybe it's a big vacation. Maybe it's buy a new car. Maybe it's move to the south of France. But what is it? Because this time period is critical. That time period immediately after the kids leave home, to really be intentional and have some really fun stuff planned intentionally to look forward to, because there's a gap. There's a gap when the kids leave home. And then just lastly, quickly, what are some fun things you can do right now if you have young kids to get them signed up for some fun things? Because as we spoke about in the last lesson, our world seems to have kind of changed to this idea of child-centric families and marriages, and yet I hope I made the point pretty clearly in the last lesson that child-centric marriages aren't good for the marriage, but they're not good for the kids either. They're not good for the kids either. So what are some little quick things that you could probably grab right now that might be fun for your children to just do to start developing the friendships and the independence that are really going to help them in their future, in their current situation and their future, but surely their future, just their development and maturity. what's the daycare you're gonna locate right now? What's that park district program you're gonna locate that I bet you could find in 15 minutes in your local community? That here's a class, an after school program. Um, I wrote down something about my gym where my wife and I go every Saturday. There's a grand parade of kids going into the gym when we're leaving because there's some fun child-centered programming that happens at the gym that Regan and I go to. So, what's your takeaway from lesson 3, kids? What's the matter with kids? What's your one takeaway? Will you do it now? Okay, good, good. Now, on to lesson 4. On to lesson 4. Here's the introduction to lesson 4: forcing change, creating a crisis. At the macro level, right, this course, Achieve Your Magnificent Marriage, is 5 lessons. And here's what we're transitioning to in lessons 4 and 5. Lessons 1, 2, and 3, I would suggest to you in a lot of ways, they're lessons where I am attempting to really paint a picture of how you can really proactively sort of create and put yourself in the best position to have an ideal marriage, right? We talked about big things like who to marry, when to marry, when, time of life, age. How can you build the best foundation in the early years of your marriage, right? You can go back to those lessons, but and then last lesson, sort of, marriage and trying to, again, create that best situation, ideal situation in the context of now we're adding children, right? So, before the big day, the early years building the right foundation, and now handling marriage in the context of children. Those first 3 lessons are very much, again, it's trying to give you the tools and the knowledge to really create the ideal. But now here we are, last 2 lessons. We're a fallen race in a fallen place, right? That's right from Genesis 3. Sin came into the world in the Garden of Eden, and now we're all born sinners. And at a simple, totally, secular level, we all know that life is hard and life is not perfect. And the reality is, even though we're trying to, many of us, I would imagine, are trying to really be great husbands or wives and really build a great marriage, the reality is we're not going to have perfect marriages, and change and growth is going to have to happen. And that's difficult in any context, and it's very difficult in the marriage context. So, what do you do? How do you affect change as your marriage maybe is not all it cracked up to be? You have problems, and you know that something needs to get better and something needs to change to make your life and your marriage better, and sometimes for your marriage to survive. So that's what I'm going to really take a deep dive into in lesson 4, force change, create a crisis. So these are, here's Peter Olsens' philosophy on affecting change in marriage. Here are 3 things you can do with perhaps different levels of effectiveness, okay? Number 1, you can nag your spouse, right? I would suggest to you that's probably not going to be too effective, but it's one thing you can do. Secondly, you can grow and improve together. You can grow and improve together. This is where I would suggest and hope that many people are and can be, because I think this is where you should be, right? I mean, the status quo is probably never, excuse me, where you want to be. You want to be growing and improving. And that's really what I'm going to specifically, that's really the focus of lesson 5. Sort of in just the normal, let's just say a good marriage, but maybe, you have areas where you need to grow and improve. How do you do that? That's really what I'm going to focus on in lesson 5. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this broad area of affecting change here. So nag your spouse, probably not too effective. Grow and improve together. If everybody's on board and really committed to the marriage and committed to constantly improving the marriage, this really is the sweet spot of where you'd love to be and where I would hope you would aspire to be. But then lastly, the third chunk here is what I'm calling create a crisis. And that's the segue into really what the remainder of this lesson 4 is going to be about, creating a crisis. Okay? And here's what I'm going to go into deep in lesson 4. It's basically the marital equivalent of having a heart attack and using a heart attack in the health context as a good thing, right? Meaning you probably wouldn't wish that you would have a heart attack, but if you also know that when you have a heart attack, that 6 months later, because you had a heart attack, you are now going to change your life and your habits massively, just in terms of how you eat, how you exercise, maybe your stress level. And you know that now, because you had that heart attack, 6 months from now, you're going to be in the most, healthy, best place you could possibly be health-wise. Sometimes that heart attack can be a wonderful blessing in disguise to really affect a wonderful change in your personal health. That's what I'm now going to segue into in this chapter. What are some of the things you can do that are the equivalent of a heart attack in your marriage when it's really in a crisis situation, but you're not giving up on it, but you know that some things need to change? And what are some ways to create a crisis and use a crisis to force good change in your marriage? A biblical perspective on separation and divorce. The remainder of this lesson, after this slide, I am going to highlight 3 broad ideas that I have experience with and that I often recommend to people within this circle, or with this idea of how to create a crisis. Generally, right, I'm focused on creating a magnificent marriage for you. And so I'm going to talk about 3 broad ways to use essentially separation and divorce to improve your marriage. Now, one of those 3 ideas is going to be the idea of, if you actually do want to proceed with completing a divorce, and sort of the best way to do that, grant you. But before I jump into those 3 broad ideas of basically real world using separation physically or legally and divorce to improve a marriage and improve a family, let's get a little backstory from a Christian perspective and a biblical perspective on what the Bible says about separation and divorce. So, first, let me first say this. This is a great resource that you might pick up, a real short book, deep but short, not looking at it, but in the low 100s of pages. I would say 125 pages ish. Marriage, Divorce, and Remarriage in the Bible by Jay Adams. I'm trying to give I am going to give a broad overview of what the Bible says about separation and divorce on this slide and hopefully in the rest of this course. But I would be it's extremely flippant of me to say that in the next 5 to 10 minutes or the next 40 minutes of this lesson that I can do justice to a deep theology on marriage, divorce, and remarriage in the Bible. Jay Adams' book is a very good read on the theology of the topic, and frankly a lot of the basis for my material. I'll tell you the other thing that's also a good resource that I use a lot is just the gotquestions.org website. They have a ton of great stuff on real Bible-based answers to essentially important cultural questions of our day. So those are two things I would direct you to: the gotquestions.org website, and for a deeper dive, Jay Adams' book there. But I don't want to avoid this topic entirely. So let's dig into some of the scripture and really get a framework for what we as followers of Jesus need to know about God's view and Jesus and the Bible's view of separation and divorce. So first, God hates divorce. We're going to talk about some situations where the Bible, and perhaps you as a not Christian, where the Bible maybe isn't your guide, might think it's appropriate and fine to get divorced. But even in those situations where maybe there's infidelity or abandonment or domestic violence, it's still not something that has to happen. God hates divorce, right? Reading from the ESV here in the Malachi verse, Malachi 2:16. For the man who does not love his wife, but divorces her, says the Lord, the God of Israel, covers his garment with violence, says the Lord of hosts. So guard yourselves in your spirit, and do not be faithless. That's the ESV. I know a couple of versions say just, flat out, it's God saying, God hates divorce. I hate divorce. So let's just have that right out front. Divorce should never be the goal, regardless of what has transpired. Yet, this concept, the divorce concept, is a biblical concept. Although, and let me pull out another slide. Although God did not create divorce when Adam and Eve were in the garden and the world was, perfect as God intended and created it to be before sin entered the world, God did not create divorce. However, the Bible does regulate divorce. The Jeremiah and Matthew references, I'm not going to read those in their entirety here, but I believe that the Jeremiah reference is God speaking to the Israelites and using sort of divorce phraseology and divorce terminology. And the Matthew 1 verse there is actually, Mary and Joseph speaking, Joseph referencing divorcing Mary quietly, as part of the birth of Jesus story, right? Where because Mary was a virgin, and God, God's son, it came to her versus, right, traditional procreation. That's the Matthew 1 verse there in terms of Joseph, Mary's husband, talking about divorcing her quietly. So this concept of divorce is biblical, although God did not create the divorce. When people came to Moses, and later when people question Jesus, and Paul references a divorce process, God does regulate divorce. And the Deuteronomy reference there, Deuteronomy 24, I'll just read Deuteronomy 24, verse 1. When man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out, and she departs out of his house. So there is some of basically the framework, in a sense, that we sort of still apply today in terms of a filing or a certificate. Obviously, this was a one-way thing where the man could do it only, but God does, and the Bible does, regulate the divorce process. Interestingly, because, just as somebody who is in the family law, divorce, and legal separation legal space, it's interesting that, as long as I've been practicing law, and probably far prior to that, we have basically three ways to sort of undo a marriage. You can sort of get what's called an annulment or an invalidity of marriage, where it's as if you were never married. There's something called legal separation, where obviously the marriage technically is not over, but there is a legal framework under which you're separated. And then there, is what we, most states actually call a dissolution of marriage, or a divorce, where the marriage is ended that way. Interestingly, however, the Bible never talks about separation. So Bible does talk about a divorce process. It never talks about a legal separation process. When is divorce okay? So we've acknowledged that God hates divorce. We've also acknowledged that the Bible, however, does regulate divorce. When is divorce okay? Now, let me just give some biblical basis, and then for the most part punt and suggest do a deep dive with your pastor and get into that Jay Adams book on this topic. But let's reference some scripture in terms of when divorce is okay. Let's read from Matthew 19, verse 9. And this is Jesus speaking. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness, and marries another woman, commits adultery. So that's one of the bases. I think the Bible is rather clear on just the idea that unfaithfulness and adultery is something that Jesus has spoken about as an appropriate and allowable time and reason to move forward with a divorce. Now, the 1 Corinthians verse there, 1 Corinthians 7, I believe the specific reference really would be 7 verse 15, speaks to the abandonment idea. I mean, there is some back and forth on is this allowed in the context of two married Christians, or if one of the spouses is an unbeliever. But I think most commentaries, believers, biblical people who know their Bible would suggest that adultery and abandonment are really the only biblical bases for divorce. You'll also hear some exceptions given. I know I've actually had a pastor counsel me that domestic violence and abuse is also a valid reason. However, in just actually looking at a gotquestions.org answer to what does the Bible say about divorce and remarriage, it's not listed as such in the Bible, the abuse idea. So those are some of the biblical bases for divorce. So I'm going to leave it there in terms of a biblical perspective on separation and divorce, that God hates divorce. However, a divorce process is outlined in the Bible. Some specific reasons and bases are given when divorce is appropriate. And just a small caveat that although divorce is referenced, legal or separation otherwise is not referenced in the Bible. So here's crisis number one that I am suggesting is a way to force change with the motivation of, again, improving your marriage, saving, changing your marriage. Crisis number one, physically separate. This might be a legal separation. This might be just what I'm describing there. Totally nothing in the legal context. Physical separation. And I'm going to give you a couple very personal stories supporting this, because I know of professionals who use and support this, and I know of a couple very specific examples that I am involved with and have seen in the past and currently up close. So what am I talking about here? I might be talking, they're legal separation, right? I'm not talking about really are physically separate. I'm not necessarily talking about a totally legal concept. So what potentially could this look like? I think there could be different permutations. I'm going to give you some ideas, however, about how to separate as a form of creating a crisis to improve your marriage. Leave physically and informally. Here's how I would talk through this and suggest this might be needed. This might be needed, and when. Right, on slide number one of the ways, and I would say in the best ideal situation, you as a married couple are growing and improving together. You're acknowledging that, hey, I as a husband, I got plenty of problems, but you know what? I'm committed to building a wonderful marriage, and therefore I'm going to do certain things in the context of my marriage to grow and improve. Grow and improve together, right? That should just be something that Regan and I, my wife and I, are committed to and through, right? Worshiping together, praying together, going to marriage conferences together, just all of the different ways that we can grow and improve are doing. Now, but let me get into how perhaps a situation that's like my marriage might then transition to a situation where a more forceful, if you will, crisis needs to be created because, option two of sort of both parties growing and improving together simply is not working. Perhaps you've set up some boundaries and or some ideas on how to improve aspects of your marriage. These are just some brainstorms, but maybe your wife has a problem spending money. Maybe your wife has a gambling problem, and so you've set a rule or a boundary in your marriage that the person without the financial largesse and gambling problem is solely in control of marital resources. Maybe you set up that rule. Maybe I, as a husband, am coming home late constantly. Maybe I'm out partying with my friends. Maybe I'm just being undisciplined in terms of my work life, and I'm just missing dinner with my wife, time with my family all the time. And we set some sort of a rule or a boundary that if I'm not home by 7:15, um, my wife is going to have dinner without me, and leftovers are going to be left in the kitchen or refrigerator. Um, Maybe I have a rule, or maybe we've come to some rule or boundary about my anger, outbursts of anger. And we have said, I am going to start going to an anger management counselor twice a week or something, right? I lay out those concepts in the circle of talking about legitimate, smart ways that a husband and wife could be growing and improving their marriage together, right? Smart, intelligent, voluntary boundaries. But now these boundaries are not working. Somebody is, not following the financial rule, the get home rule, the attending therapy, and the anger concept. So now what do? Some of this sort of voluntary, agreed upon working to improve and grow together is not working. So then this is when I think you have to look and say, if this isn't working, I need to do something much more crises oriented to get my spouse's attention. So this is when I think and would suggest it's appropriate to leave physically. And again, I say informally just in the context of it's not legal. So now you go to the extended stay hotel. Now you go to the short-term lease. Now you move in with a friend, perhaps with your parents or with an adult sibling. Um, Formal separation, a formal separation. And my third bullet point, I'll just get it out there, is actually a legal separation. But let me talk about this formal separation because I've seen this concept. A woman who is a psychologist and an attorney and a friend of mine, she advocates this, and a Christian by the way. She advocates and actually helps people formulate sort of this middle picture. In other words, a therapist involved who really formalizes a separation picture and sort of a trial divorce picture. And right, she's sort of the judge and she's the professional that these people are utilizing to essentially create a framework of what does a separation look like financially, emotionally, physically. And obviously she is an attorney, has expertise in, giving them guidance as to what the picture would look like. Okay, you're not divorced, but here's what it would look like if you were divorced in terms of, let's call it, pain, maintenance or spousal support, child support for the children, what that looks like, what a division of property looks like. And because this woman is also a therapist, she is actually also doing some, very traditional counseling with couples. So this is a picture I've seen very personally utilized successfully, and I recommend and refer some folks to this attorney, a doctor who's also an attorney. So that's one picture that I've seen used in the physically separate idea to just give it a little more, intelligence and an outside sort of expert professional perspective. Again, in the idea of we're using separation not to damage a marriage, but rather we're using separation to create a crisis to improve the marriage. And then lastly, I would just add, there is something called a legal separation. Essentially, it's like the one above, the formal separation, just where, you know, finances and sort of a trial divorce picture is laid out. But I guess just the extra level of seriousness, or my lawyer hat being enforceability, is the idea that this is a court order now, right? Those things above, financial provisions such as alimony and child support, etc., parenting time, custody, visitation. These things are now not just being overseen by, a voluntary therapist attorney, like in my example and real world scenario above, but rather it is now under the auspices of a judge court order and more severe penalties if you are not following the terms of the separation. So create a crisis by physically separating. Let me share with you a story just to wrap up this slide. I've had a client recently who has been using this idea, and really it's not my client in a sense; it's more his spouse, where my client has had in the past some anger management issues. And what are they doing? I don't know all their backstory, their full history, in terms of how what they did in terms of sort of voluntary stuff to sort of grow and improve together. But here's what I know: these guys are committed to not getting divorced. However, they have physically separated. They are actually using that middle bullet point there, sort of a therapist overseeing an attempt to reconcile, but they physically separated. One of the spouses has remained in the marital residence with the children, and one of the spouses has, left the marital residence, is still seeing his children regularly, and is undergoing some very intensive anger management counseling. So those are a few real world examples within the concept of physically separating to force change and improve a marriage. Crises number 2. Create this crisis, second crisis to create to improve your marriage, underline improve, is actually to file for divorce. You're filing for divorce, though, not to actually get divorced. Okay? Sounds strange, but again, we're talking about a marriage that needs a heart attack to make it healthier. Okay? This slide and the next slide, which is a video, let me tease out that video a little bit. The video is actually 3 very specific situations that I've been involved with, 2 of which I was involved with as the lawyer on the case, and one of which, one instance is a close relationship of mine where I saw, not the lawyer, but again, I know the person really well, and again, saw this strategy of filing for divorce, or in one of the 3 I actually speak about, just hiring me as a lawyer, and kind of the idea that I'm really, really serious about getting some change in our marriage. This idea of filing for divorce was used in 3 instances, and the marriages today are in great shape, and yet these are people who had divorces going and filed and pending. So so that's a tease out of the video. Don't miss it. It's just 6 or 7 minutes, but there's 3 real world examples of really serious crisis being created with you know good results. Um, so just some data here. Average divorce in the U.S. costs somewhere around $12,000 to $15,000, and takes 11 months in duration. There's a wide range of time of divorce. I would tell you that. We have cases that are over in 6 months. Strike that, in 6 weeks, I was going to say. And I know there's a matter we've been actively working on recently that's going on 3.5 years. A lot of different X factors. Whether or not you have children is a big driver of how long a case takes. But mostly, I just want to underline actually the key thing here being just divorce and the legal process of divorce is a slow process. That's essentially what undergirds this idea of filing for divorce without necessarily wanting divorce, because you're creating a crisis, right? Your husband or wife is getting served with a summons and a petition for divorce. I'm sure anybody is going to say that is a crisis. That is going to get my attention. Yes, but this is the key. This is why I use this strategy and advocate this strategy sometimes, is even though now, you've been served with divorce, or you serve somebody with a divorce, filing, there's a lot of time between start of case and potential end of case. And that's the trick here. Because this is a strategy I play out when I'm involved in the filing for divorce, not to get divorced, but filing for divorce to create a crisis and actually improve a marriage. I do what I call a protect and delay strategy. And right, the idea is simply, you do have a case in court, and my client still needs to be protected. If somebody else is filing a divorce against somebody, I can't have them getting taken advantage of and just railroaded in a sense without smart, aggressive legal representation. But so that's what I say, protect. But the delay is, it's really easy to make a divorce case. It's really easy, I would say, in general, to make the legal process and the court system go slowly in probably any area, but I'm talking specifically about divorce. And that's essentially how I play this with people is, if I'm the lawyer in the situation, is, look, I can guarantee you something like 6 months to a year where where we can stop a divorce from happening. But now you need to do the heavy lifting. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a pastor. I'm not your buddy. I'm your attorney. And I'm saying on legal strategy, I can protect you and I can delay things. But now you got to do the heavy lifting. Get some professional help, get some close friends and therapists involved. And the other part of the file for divorce sort of strategy, or the crises that it entails, is and this is also a point sort of education for maybe the persons who aren't that familiar with the court process, is there are a lot of people who are in divorce court who actually don't necessarily want to get divorced. Very legitimate social science research that I have reviewed and studied suggests something around 25 to 30% of people who are in divorce court are at least something that you might call mixed agenda people, meaning in divorce court but not necessarily wanting to get divorced. And again, this needs to be front and center to people. Just if you're going through a divorce, I feel like the court system, and even uh, just as a Christian, churches and counselors and pastors, um, there's this wrong-headed viewpoint that case in court means stop the work of marriage repair. That's wrong, and it's wrong primarily because of this fact that I'm discussing here, that a huge number of people are in divorce court, whatever, a third of the 1.5 million or 1.25 million cases that are filed in the United States every year. What is that? 300,000 or 400,000 people are actually in a divorce case. You know what? It's a marriage that can be improved and saved uh, while they're in the divorce process. And so that would be my underlying point to you. If you're in this situation, you're in a divorce, I'd encourage you. It's not over. If you're somebody who has friends, or if you're in sort of a pastoral counseling situation, don't give up on people just because they're in a divorce case. And one other piece I would just recommend very strongly is if this strategy is something that is necessary for you, i.e., you're at a situation where the only thing that's going to get a spouse's attention and that's going to bring about the change and improvement that is absolutely possible, if you're at this point, be really careful about your lawyer selection. I'll tell you, here's a real story I've dealt with very recently where I'm not sure if this couple's actually sort of in this box of filing for divorce. They're not there yet. I do know that they're not there yet. I think they're essentially using the crises of physical separation. But where I was going to go with it is whether they're in that, the physical legal separation box or the filing for divorce box. What box I know they're in is they want to reconcile their marriage. And it's really critical to pick the right attorney in this situation. And that could be me. But I think interestingly, just playing out this situation that I've been involved with is this particular gentleman's pastor actually reached out to me before kind of we were retained as his attorney, mostly to gauge my faith background and my beliefs, because you do not just that perspective, but also how you would approach a case, because there are a lot of lawyers who we're involved with who are just in the business of creating conflict and damaging marriages and damaging families, maybe ostensibly to win whatever in the context of divorce, but it's certainly not doing the types of things that are trying to bolster a marriage or trying to save a marriage. So get very careful about lawyer selection if you want to create a crisis by filing for divorce, but not really wanting a divorce. And finally, crisis number 3, get divorced, right? We spoke about it, and the Bible speaks about it. It's biblical, but I do want to give you some guidance on how to best approach divorce if that's the route you choose. And let me just say this one more time before I do jump into this. You'd be amazed at how late, even in the divorce process, that people will drop a divorce case and say, I heard this in the last month or two. I wasn't involved in this case. I was sitting in the courtroom though, and these guys were at what we call the divorce prove-up date, which is basically the last court date in a divorce case. And this wife, basically dropped the divorce case, um, and publicly exclaimed in this open courtroom that I think it's best for myself and my family to not get divorced. I don't know the specifics of that case, but it seemed like there were a number of lawyers involved, and that had been going on for quite some time, and yet even at that late of a date, she chose to basically not go forward. And I know nothing about her situation other than what I saw in court that day, but basically said, I've used this crisis, and I think my marriage and family is the better route. So never give up, never give up. And that's a real situation that literally, that marriage was 10 minutes from being over. Divorce prove up is a 10-minute kind of summary thing. And that woman said, I'd rather create and improve my marriage. Okay? Now, that being said, there are times when that's not possible. We've seen in Deuteronomy 24 that there is a biblical divorce process. And let me suggest 3 broad approaches, just as somebody who's in this space professionally, right? What I'm involved with every day is, sometimes, well, I'm 100% involved in family law all day, every day. And a third or more, half of which includes practicing divorce law. Now, let's talk about 3 broad approaches. Seriously, if you're in a situation where divorce is necessary, there are still, best ways to do a divorce. Okay. Here are the 3 broad boxes. Okay. Let me just give really kind of broad overviews. And seriously, this is something where if you're at crises 3, get divorced, it's time to do a consultation with an attorney. Okay. 3 broad approaches. An uncontested divorce. Uncontested divorce, that's the one, I think I referenced it earlier in this lesson, but basically that can be a 2-month process. And it is what it says it is. It's basically you're agreeing with your spouse on everything really before the case is even filed and before the case is in court. And now everything's agreed, signed off on. And now, I'm going to file that case and get that final quote, quote, prove up court date in 2 weeks. And, the entire case is done. And, when I talk to clients, I suggest 6 to 8 weeks is very possible. And maybe even faster in certain parts of the world, country, just depending on how court systems move. I'm just familiar with basically greater Chicagoland. So that's option 1. You can do an uncontested divorce, limited assets, maybe no children, and the contentiousness level of the parties is low. This is a great, if you're doing a divorce, this is a great way to do it. Inexpensive, least expensive, shortest amount of time. So an uncontested divorce is one of 3 approaches. Number 2, if things are a little more contentious, or I would say even probably more something I see more commonly is just if it's a longer term marriage and you have more serious sorts of issues at issue, the uncontested marriage can be a little difficult because that is kind of quick and fast. And, broad approach number 2 would be some sort of a mediation process. Okay. And a mediation process is, when I know people have children and have been married a while and have some degree of wealth and assets, and I'm asked basically what's the best approach to a divorce. It's mediation. It's a mediation process. It's a process where you're going to have a social worker, or better yet, an attorney who's really skilled at family law, but is also skilled and trained as a mediator. You're basically going to say, we're getting divorced, but we're going to keep this thing out of court. And we're going to work with this professional to assist us in coming up with the terms of the divorce. And then the only thing we're going to do in divorce court is basically the minimum piece that you do have to do in divorce court, which is, marriages these days are, do have a piece of government regulation, in terms of a marriage license and that thing. So the final piece does need to be in court. In other words, a case is filed, but then all you're doing is you're filing a case and you're doing the divorce prove-up hearing. And, so you're really only in court for literally a month or less, and maybe 10 days or less. But the crux of the work and the heavy lifting and the negotiating is 100% in this sort of out of court process with you, spouse, and a trained mediator. Absolutely the best approach to divorce if you're going to, go through a divorce. We have we've just added that actually at our firm. I don't really put that out there as a sales idea. I put that out there, to underline the idea that I firmly believe this is the best approach to divorce if divorce is, something you've said is needed. So, an uncontested divorce is an option. A mediated divorce is an option. And then, really last option, and these are broad brushes, don't get me wrong, but last option is basically a fully litigated, fully in court divorce process. Now, even in that scenario, there's huge differences between sort of the cases in court and it's puttering along at a sort of uncontested, or let's just say not particularly heated or litigated situation, but you're still having court dates every 45 days and incurring fees and expenses and the stress that's involved in court. That's very different than the thing that's, in court heavily contested every 2 weeks and is going on, blah, blah, blah. But just in terms of a third broad approach, it would be that approach. It would be, most expensive, most time consuming, and if avoidable, the worst way to approach divorce, just because stress, time, money, and candidly, after divorce, damage, right? Damage to you as the litigant, damage to children as people who are often sort of stuck in the middle. So, think about these broad ideas, and if you can fit it into, box number 1 or box number 2, I can't stress that enough. I mean, because even if you're going through a divorce, and if divorce is going to happen and it is inevitable, there's a future. There's a future, and how are you going to be in the best position just to live and parent and to be basically, be the best you can be post-divorce. Your people are very damaged by a contentious divorce process. So even if you're doing a divorce, consider if you can get it into an uncontested or mediated situation. And I think I sort of answer how not to waste time and money in the bullet point above. Really try to keep it in the mediated or uncontested box. Another, just a couple words to the wise are just, you have 3 big parts of a divorce case, okay? Here's how I would break it up. You have what is ultimately going to be in a final judgment. Very important in terms of financial division, financial support, custody of children, parenting time with children. Okay, so the ultimate terms in a divorce judgment critical. Okay, don't don't you know underspend, take enough time on that piece of a case. However, there are two other parts of a case that I find to be very often contentious and unnecessary that really drive the waste and of the time and money. And that's these two issues. Okay, temporary matters. Okay, what will be the setup while the divorce case is going on? Right, if you're in that third broad approach of you have a case in court. How do you keep, even in that situation where there are going to be some regular court dates, how do you keep the temperature a little lower? Because sometimes you have basically two cases, right? You're fighting about stuff constantly during the pendency of divorce, temporary parenting time, temporary custody, temporary child support, all the time. And then you're also fighting about what's going to be in that final judgment. Try to maintain the status quo. Try to do some of that stuff on the side because that's wasteful. That's what drives a 3-year case. Is fighting over temporary stuff. And the second thing is how much investigation or sort of discovery, as we call it, or financial investigation are you going to need to do? Again, you don't want to give that short shirk if it's needed. If your husband or wife, I don't know, has 6 different closely held businesses that you know nothing about, you're going to have to do some of that investigation. But if you're sort of a normal, an average sort of financial person with income and maybe a retirement plan and a home and a car, do you really need to have an attorney peeling through every account and every document and every credit card statement that's happened over the last 10 years? Maybe you don't. Okay, so we talked about 3 broad approaches to divorce, and that's just a little, maybe almost like under bullet on how not to waste time or money. The end of a divorce case and the final terms, absolutely high importance, but if you can eliminate some of that temporary stuff and unnecessary investigation, usually a good move to avoid. And just wrapping, how do you set yourself up for the best post-divorce future? Okay, there is a future, and how do you put yourself in the best position? Think about a therapist and a mental health solution. I was at a conference not long ago where there was actually a reference to Pete Roses, the baseball player, his son having been interviewed, and he described that his parents going through a divorce, even then, as I'm thinking, as a 40-something, 50-something adult, was the worst thing that happened to him. Okay? So, don't underestimate the damage of divorce, okay, to children and to yourself if you're a spouse or a party to it, okay? Get help because if not, you're going to remain damaged. Change doesn't just happen because of time. Change happens, through legitimate counseling and therapy. Many people beyond that, that example, I can think, in my personal life, refer to their divorce as the worst thing that ever happened to me. I'll tell you, somebody I follow on social media and I've read her book is a woman named Lisa Aarons. Interesting read, Lessons from the End of a Marriage. Check it out. I'm just looking at Amazon right now, but I connect with her pretty regularly in social media space. She was really transparent about her divorce process. But right, get the help you need. so you're set up for that best future in that sense, or the mental health regard. I would suggest you try to vow, and maybe not just try, vow to never be in court again. You know, we are involved. I am involved in a lot of post-divorce litigation, and you don't want to be that person. You don't want to be. You don't want to be in court for 20 years. You don't want to be in court for 15 years. If you're getting divorced, okay, that's it. Okay, don't vow never to go to court again. And candidly, if an attorney's doing a job well, I know it's always one of my goals to basically keep a case out of court forever. If you don't have children, it should absolutely be very, very easily done. If you have children, there's some more changeable issues with children, but even in the parenting context, if sort of some mediation provisions are included, there isn't much that can't be avoided or kept out of court. Frankly, the normal case with children, probably the only thing maybe that really needs underlying to be in court again post divorce might be to just terminate child support. When a kid's graduated from high school or something. So, how do you set up the best post divorce future? You get the help you need because you realize your damage. Get 6 months to a year of counseling. Vow never to return to court. And then lastly, just 3 sort of points I would suggest. Remember, if you have children, that you're still parenting partners, okay? And subpoint to that one, keep other people out. And when I say keep other people out, I'm really looking at the new significant others. The new significant others, in sort of the post-divorce context, you'd be amazed at how often you see that person driving conflict and driving litigation. If you're getting remarried or re-involved with, next significant others, the advice here is be very clear with that person that, you have this ex and you have children with this man or woman, and you guys are still going to be parenting together, and that's a reality. So just be careful on that one. You're still parenting partners, and watch out for drama that's stirred up by new significant others, because I see that all the time. Okay. So that's crisis number 3. If divorce is necessary, do it the best way possible so that you are set up for your best post-divorce future. And with that, I'm going to wrap lesson 4, force change. How do you force change? By creating a crisis sometimes. And hey, we're up to the last lesson, right? Lesson 5 coming up next in 2 sentences. How do you actually survive to thrive? How do you be in that second bullet point of, you've got an okay marriage, but how do you actually improve that marriage? How do you avoid getting to the point where you need to create a crisis? How are you in that change and improvement scenario where you're now moving from just okay to actually really thriving and creating that magnificent marriage?